So, as we've been going through the last 2 weeks, and this is the third of the 3 weeks that we'll do the overview. As we've been going through, are you beginning to get an idea of the content of Hebrews as we've read it and read it and read it and read it and read it? Yes. And are you starting to see the point of the book? And are you starting to see how there's the flow of thought? And that's a lot of what we talked about or looked at this week. But are you starting to see how one thing leads to the other, and that it all comes together to be the book of Hebrews? Good. I'm glad that we're starting to see it. Now, it doesn't mean that you got it all down yet, but that you're starting to piece it together. You're starting to see how it all fits together. So today, we're going to talk about the flow of thought in the book. And that is going to, this last week of the overview is going to lead us into our in-depth study of chapters 1 through 4 of Hebrews. So we're going to begin with review, because you know I love a good review. So do you remember from the first week and from last week that we talked about the 4 corners of the puzzle that we're building, that is the book of Hebrews? It's still up here, in shadows. So, but I'm going to do it over here, so you know you can cheat if you want to, whatever you need. Okay, so we've got our little 4 corners, and what's that first top corner? The author. And we discovered some things about the author. What basic things do you remember about the author from our discussion over the last couple of weeks in our overview?
We don't know who it is, but we know he's a contemporary of Timothy.
Yes. So we kind of have a little bit of where we could place him on the timeline. Does he have a relationship to the recipients?
Yes.
Yeah, he's known them. He
Calls them brethren.
Calls them brethren, beloved. He is exhorting them, so it's exhorting him as a brother, as a fellow follower, and in a sense as a leader, right? Because he's further down the road, because what has happened to them? Let's talk about the recipients a little bit.
They've fallen away.
Well, they kind of started drifting, maybe, right? Or there's a danger of them drifting, right?
There's a dullness.
Right, there's a dullness to what's going on. But we do know that they are believers or unbelievers?
Believers.
They are believers. They have exhibited some fruit in the past. Do you remember what he says some of the fruit that they've exhibited in the past is?
They ministered to others. They lost their possessions.
Right. They endured.
Suffered.
Yeah, they endured through that suffering, right? And what is their relationship to those who have suffered even more than them? Say the ones that are in
They helped the
prison.
prisoners.
Yeah, they were of one heart with them, right? So it shows that unity of the body that is evident in their lives. But as Carolyn said, they have drifted, dulled a little bit. There's some dangers that they face that they need to make sure that they are aware of. And so we come to the purpose for the book being written. And what is the purpose? What did we settle on as the purpose for the book of Hebrews?
It's a word of exhortation.
Yes, it's a word of exhortation, so it's telling them to do things, right? He says, bear with this brief word of exhortation, which is not so brief, but that it's for exhortation. Okay, and then what is our last little corner?
Historical context.
Okay, and we've talked a little bit about this. What Carolyn mentioned one of them that could place us time-wise. What thing in the book or what clue in the book could place us time-wise? If we had some extra biblical sources that we were allowed to look at and found out when Timothy was in prison, maybe. Right? There's that clue. What is the clue?
He's a contemporary of Timothy.
But it mentions Italy, is that?
It mentions Italy, and it mentions that Timothy has been
Released?
He's been released. So that he then wants to visit them. If Timothy comes to him, then he wants to go to them and with Timothy, right? So that would place us, that would let us know right when this is happening, if we were allowed to look at our extra biblical resources and find out when Timothy was in prison, what year. What other things from our discussion would tell us about the historical context? Maybe problems that they were facing or that kind of thing.
They were being persecuted and losing their property,
Yes.
which I would think would also place it historically.
Yes, so we would be able to find out, okay, when was this happening? Where was this happening? Okay, this, kind of start to piece together where these people were, who the author was. Of course, we're not going to know because the Word of God does not tell us who the author is. But what can we know about the recipients as far as them hearing the gospel? The recipients and the author. Do you remember how the gospel came to them?
Through Jesus?
It came from, it was,
They heard from others who had heard from Jesus.
right, so we have a second-hand accounting. So that if we were talking about it, the author being specific people, we could exclude the group of people that have heard directly from Jesus, because we know that the author says that they heard it from others, right? So, and what was the response of both the author and the recipients when they heard the word, heard the gospel?
They believe.
They believed. So again, that brings them into the body of believers. We don't have skeptics. He's not writing to people trying to get them saved. He's writing to them, exhorting them to what?
Live by faith.
To live by faith, to consider
To mature
Jesus.
in
Yeah, right.
Right, to mature in the
Right.
faith. And what is his primary focus that you would say the whole book is pointing to, or what would our theme of Hebrews be? Some of you had a Hebrews theme that was about Jesus, and some of you had one that was about this exhortation, and either of them are great.
Holding on to our faith in Jesus.
Holding on to our faith in Jesus.
Consider
Jesus
Jesus
is our high priest.
Our high priest.
Consider Jesus our high priest. Remember, there's a lot about the high priest. So, good. So we've kind of got that under our belts. We know a little bit about the book of Hebrews just from our overview, and those are the things that we're going to want to keep in our minds as we walk through the rest of the book of Hebrews. So believe me, I love a good review. We will be reviewing this as we go along so that we always keep it in its proper context. We don't just suddenly start saying things that are out of this framework. Okay, so today, another thing too, today's video that we're going to watch will discuss even more of this historical context. So that'll be really helpful to get some background. So last week we laid out the book's chapter themes, right? And that was tedious. That was a long discussion.
Unnecessary.
And it's wonderful to have those things. Now remember, like I said, some of you have your chapter themes as what is about Jesus, what you see about Jesus in specific chapters. And then others have exhortation. What are they told to do? What are we told to do in this chapter? Some of you have a mix of them. Yes, and that's totally
And then
fine.
there's those of us that are mixed up.
That's totally fine, but remember that we want to keep it in that framework. Remember, our book, our chapter themes kind of make up these side pieces. So as long as it fits within that framework and it's something that helps you to remember what's in the book of Hebrews, great. As long as it's one of the, it's in that framework. So today we're going to look at chapter 1 a little bit closer, because remember at the end of the week we did our observation worksheet for a couple of days on chapter 1, and then that's going to lead us into talking about the flow of thought for the rest of the book. So let's have out our observation worksheet for chapter 1. You might as well just get all your observation worksheets out. I mean, they're just great to have. And then have your, you might want to have your little at a glance chart. That's at the end on page 128. And then you may also want to have out, just for later as we do our discussion, you may want to have out your homework and any of the extra pages that you had that talked about the flow of thought for the book. So we'll just have all that out and we'll be ready to go. Okay, so let's look at chapter 1. Okay, who is this chapter 1 of Hebrews about? God, and who more specifically?
Jesus.
Yes. So we have Jesus as the focus of this chapter. And what is the comparison that we find in verses 1 and 2?
Better than angels. Oh, comparison.
In 1 and 2.
Of how he spoke previously and how he's speaking now.
Right, okay, so long ago, he spoke through
Prophets.
to the fathers, through the prophets, in many portions and in many ways. But now, verse 2, in these last days, he's spoken to us how?
Through his son.
And his son.
Right, and then what does it say about him? How does it define him in those next few verses through the end of verse 2 and all the way into verse 4?
He's the heir of all things.
Yes.
Through all things were made, the world.
Yes.
He's the radiance of God's glory.
Exact representation of God's nature.
Right.
Upholds all things by the word of his power. There's a lot of theology.
Oh,
in
yes.
that second,
Yes.
third, and fourth verses.
Yes, there is. And what did he do?
He sat down at the right hand of
What did he do before that?
Created the world.
Purification of sins.
Yeah, he made purifications of sins, and then he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. And what does it say about him in verse 4?
Became better than the angels. And
Yeah.
had a more excellent name than the angels.
Right, and so there's, as Carolyn said, there's a lot of theology about Jesus
Yeah.
there. And so as we go through into next week, we will start being able to really unpack what all that means. But we're just kind of getting the what does it say at this point. Now, what's in verses 5 through 14? What's the comparison there
Between Jesus and angels.
between Jesus and angels? So we have the first part, the first comparison was between the prophets who spoke the word of God and Jesus who spoke the word of God. And now we have the comparison between angels and Jesus. So what is he compared to the angels?
Better than.
Better than.
Well, he's a son.
He's a son, and the angels are,
messengers.
right, so they have completely different roles, right? And again, we're going to get more into, this is still part of our overview, even though we've started to get a little more detail in chapter 1, but we will be looking at what the Bible has to say about angels and what Hebrews has to say about angels as we go into further in our study. Now, what does verse 6 say about angels?
That the angels are to worship him?
Yeah, and who tells them, or who says that the angels are to worship? And let's talk about the he's and the who's. Okay,
Yeah.
they're to worship.
Yeah.
Well, if they didn't capitalize, we would.
Right, the angels are to worship whom?
Jesus.
Jesus, is it who or whom?
Whom?
That's right, okay, just make sure.
After the preposition.
So they are to worship Jesus, but who tells them that they are to worship Jesus?
God.
That's theology, right? That's some pretty deep
Yeah,
theology, because we know from the Old Testament that God will not give his glory to any other. So what does it say when he says to the angels, you are to worship this one?
That he is God.
That he is God, right? So
But-
we're going to get into that further and further. Go ahead and
Well,
ask your
it's just the verbiage, the verbs here, when it says, having become much better.
Yes.
Makes it sound like at some point he wasn't.
It's very interesting, isn't it? And we're going to get there.
And I don't like that.
Well, it's funny, and I did get to preview some of the video. Kay is going to talk a little bit about that.
Okay.
And basically what she tells you is what I'm going to tell you.
Okay.
We'll get to that.
Okay.
Okay.
I figured that, but I thought I have to throw it in.
Because there are some things in here that are head scratchers that, you know, that require a little bit further study, because we know that God's word is not going to contradict.
Right.
So we know that there's got to be a way around this puzzle, right?
Right.
And we're going to figure out our way around
I
the
was
puzzle.
hoping so.
Okay. So we do find out in verse 6 that we are that the angels are to worship the firstborn of God, which is the Son. Okay, what does it tell us about the angels in verse 7?
They're his winds and ministers of a flame of fire.
Yeah, so it tells kind of what their job is, right? Or what he can do to empower them. And it's who that's empowering them?
Who is?
God the Father.
Yeah, God the Father. It says, and of the angels, he says, he being God the Father, says of the angels, who makes his angels winds, and his ministers flames of fire. So we know that they have power, but whom do they get their power from?
God the Father.
From God the Father. Okay, and they serve him, right? Now, what is the contrast that we find in verses 8 and 9? Verse 8 begins with that big word, but. And then what is that contrast?
It's with the Son versus the angels he was just talking about.
Right, so it's a contrast between the Son and the angels. And it's really interesting because it's also what God has said of his Son, right? So it's what he has to say about the angels contrasted with what he has to say about the Son. And what does he say of the Son?
His throne is forever.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
Yes, wait a minute. So God, the Father, calls the Son God.
Yeah.
So again, there's lots of theology here. Again, we're going to have the opportunity to look at it. But I mean, just from a cursory reading, they're telling us big time things about this Son, right? And what else?
Righteous.
Yeah, he's
He
righteous.
loves righteousness.
And
He
he
is a
loves-
righteous scepter.
Yes. And what has God done for him?
Anointed him with the
Anointed
oil of
him.
gladness above your companion.
Yes. And
Who are
then
his companions?
The angels.
The angels?
we're going to find
That's
out.
all.
Yeah, okay.
It didn't say.
Okay, well, what do verses 10 through 12 teach us about the Son?
He created the earth.
Yeah, and what does it call him there at the beginning?
Oh, Lord.
He is Lord, who in the beginning when? When is in the beginning?
Of creation.
Before the beginning, right? In the beginning, he laid the foundation of the earth, so he is the creator, right? And then what does it tell us in those next two verses?
That even when it goes, he will remain.
Yes, so he is eternal, right? And then also the end of verse 12, but you are what?
The same.
The same. So he is eternal, but he is also immutable. So we're seeing, lots of theology about him that we will be exploring further. He is the same and he is forever, so he is the same forever, right?
Right, go.
Okay.
So in verse 10, you Lord is Jesus.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Especially because we know that beginning of verse 8, it says, but of the Son, he says, and this is that continuing quotation, quote of what it is. Now, but you do bring up a point that it is quoting the Old Testament. So there would be possibly, the saints of the Old Testament would have thought that it was only talking about who?
God the Father.
God the Father,
Yeah.
right? But through
Yeah.
God's word, he's saying this is who it was speaking of, right? That it was speaking of the Son. So he is, he's like a pastor explaining on Sunday the passage. This is what he's explaining, that this is Jesus who this passage was talking about. Okay, now, where is he now? Where is Jesus now, according to verse 13?
Sitting at the right hand of God the Father.
Right. Now, what does it say in verse 3 about the right hand?
It's the right hand of the Majesty on high.
Where is he? And when did he get there?
After he had made purification of sins.
Right, it says, when he had made purification of sin, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. And then it says in verse 13 that that's the conversation that took place, right? When he did that, it seems, because it says, to which of the angels has he ever said? This is kind of a what do they call it? Hypothetical question. Sit at my right hand until when?
I'll make your enemies a footstool for your feet.
Okay. Now, as you're doing your observation worksheets. Rhetorical. That doesn't sound right. Now, as you're doing your observation worksheets,
What are you missing, dear?
a pen, do you see it?
No, I got you.
Here, it's
Under-
under, it's under here. Okay. Okay. Okay, so I thought I'd just give you another little tip for when you do your observation worksheets, that if it's possible, you'll always, no, not if it's possible, you will always want to mark time frames. And so you'll want to mark it with a little, I mark mine with a little clock over it, little circular clocks. You can do it however you want to, but you'll always be wanting to do that so that you can lay out the time. Now, what you could do then, because we like to make lists off of our keywords, what you can do then is sometimes, not always, you can make a timeline of what's going on in the chapter. When does it say what's going on? So I did that as I was doing my observation worksheet, which I need to take out of here so I can show it to you. Now, what's the very first event? Not necessarily the very first event mentioned, but what would be the very first thing to go on the timeline?
Creation.
Creation, right? So it would be in the beginning.
And that's in verse 10.
Verse 10. And we know what happened then?
Creation.
Creation. So even if I don't have year numbers to put at the bottom of it, I can still lay it out in an orderly fashion, right? This is actually not going to have year numbers anywhere. Okay? But on the timeline, what's the next event?
God spoke.
God spoke through who?
The prophet.
Through the prophets, right? And when was that? Long ago. Right? So again, that's letting me know. Normally I would put a year down here on my timeline, but I don't have any years. I just have it laid out in words. So long ago, God spoke through the prophets. What's next on the timeline?
In the last days.
In these last days, what's going on in these last days?
Spoken to us in the
He's
Son.
speaking through the Son.
God has spoken through his Son. Okay, what's next after that?
Eternity, your years will not come to an end.
There's one thing before
did I
that.
hear
Sat at the right hand.
Right, so it says when he had made purification, so that's what's in here. He had made purification.
What verse is that?
3.
3.
Thank you.
Sorry, I wasn't putting our verses down. When he had made purification for sin, what did he do?
Sat down at the right hand of God the Father.
Sat down at the right hand. And then what's next, Carolyn?
Then we get to eternity.
Yes, and what does he say in verse 13?
Sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet.
Okay, so this is,
Oh, verse 12, the end of verse 12, your years will not come to an end.
okay, so we know that there's there's a this, right? There's an
Yeah,
arrow that goes
yeah.
forever.
Yeah.
He talks about forever in verse 8 too.
Yes.
Oh.
Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. Well, where's his throne?
In heaven.
In heaven, he's already sitting there, right? He's already got this, so it's just going on and on and on, right? Now, so he's making the enemies a footstool. Now, let me ask you about the time signature in verse 6.
When he brings the firstborn in the world?
And when he what?
Brings the firstborn?
Oh, there's a word in there you're missing.
Again.
When
Oh,
he
again.
again brings
So
the
it's
firstborn.
Christ's return.
Right. And what does it say? He says,
Let all the angels of God worship.
right, so is this when he's made his enemies a footstool?
No.
No.
So would it be before?
Yeah.
Okay, so somewhere in here, we have the firstborn again. And they're told, the angels are told to what? Worship him? And then we have the enemies made a footstool. Now, as we're doing our study, you may find that you want to swap these. You may find that you want them just the way they are. But we're just laying it out based on what we can see in this chapter, okay? Does that make sense? So you are able to create a timeline in pretty much any chapter as long as it's got those time signatures. So you can lay out, okay, what happened first? What happened next? What happened after that? And so do you see how that's really easy to do with just by marking your time signatures?
If you look at verses 3 and 4,
Uh-huh.
then is the author saying that the angels were better than Christ until he made purification of sins?
I don't think so, but we are going to talk about that more.
Okay.
Yeah, because that is one of those things where it's like, well, wait a minute, I thought he was better. So it's going to be something that we're going to look at in future weeks. The theology that is wrapped into verses 3 and 4, and then wrapped again into 8 through 12, all of that Christology, we're going to be getting into. And now, are you going to have a complete understanding of it? Only by the Holy Spirit, right?
So would verses 5 and 6 then, the today I've begotten you, I will be a father, you shall be a son,
Right, you could-
is only referring to when he came on earth, or would that be even before?
Well, there's a place where it is, right? So again, we would find a place for that
Okay.
time signature. And you could say, I've begotten you. Now you could think, well, that could mean when he became man, right?
Mhm.
But you could also be looking at it from a different perspective and say he is begotten before the foundation of the world, right? So you'd kind of decide where you want to put that one. But that's based on your study. The ones that you can really just lay out, you'll want to, that you, like solidly, you can say this happened first, this happened second. Those other ones, like I said, even here, you may decide that that needs to be swapped. You may decide that somewhere in the middle here is when he was begotten, or you may decide somewhere here before the creation is when he was begotten, right? Okay, so again, all of that theology about who he is deep, and we're going to get there. Okay, so let's see. Then we come back to the end of the chapter of chapter 1, and we talk about what in verse 14? Are we talking about Jesus, or are we talking about angels?
Angels.
Okay, we're talking about angels, and what are we told about angels there?
They're sent out to render service for
Right.
the sake of those who will inherit salvation.
And what does he call them?
Ministering
Ministering spirits. Now, what did we find out in verse 7 about what their role was?
He makes them winds and ministers the flame of fire.
Yeah, so it seems like they're talking about the same thing, that he has made them ministers. They're ministers that are flames of fire, or winds, or just angels, right? But that what are they sent out to do, according to verse 14?
Minister.
Minister to what?
Render service.
To render service for the sake of
Inheriting
Those who
salvation.
inherit salvation.
Yeah, that's kind of an interesting thing. And so is that another one of those things that goes, well, what does that mean? We're going to get there.
And also the fact they are not all.
It says, are they not all?
Oh, are they not?
Yeah, so it's, again, it's one of
Yeah, yeah,
those,
yeah.
one of those,
One of those backwards thinking. Rhetorical?
rhetorical.
Rhetorical. What, that doesn't have an answer.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
it-
I don't know why I can't think of
Yeah.
what, yeah, that makes, okay.
Okay.
Okay, so let's,
That's
that
an
kind
obvious
of, that sets us very much firmly into chapter 1, right? To where we're starting to understand the content of chapter 1, at least how it lays out, not necessarily all the little details. So we're going to get to all the little details. But let's look at chapter 2, verse 1. How does chapter 2 relate back to verse 1?
Well, chapter 1 lays the groundwork because the very first word is therefore.
Of chapter 2,
It says for this reason.
which is a
yeah.
therefore type question.
So
Or
now this is why we're diving in.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, for this reason, what?
We pay attention to what we've
Heard.
heard because he had inferred, well, like said in the beginning, God
Spoke.
spoke.
Right,
So
and
it's this whole
then,
speaking and hearing and listening.
yeah, so we've got to be paying attention when he talks, right? So he's been talking all the way back through the prophets, and in these last days, he now is talking through his son. So therefore, you know, with all the, it's almost like the angel stuff could be a parentheses, right? Therefore, for this reason, we must pay much closer attention to what we have heard. Why?
So that we don't drift away?
So that we don't drift away from it. And then it goes on and it talks about what?
The
The
word
penalties of
spoken.
not listening.
Yeah, the penalty of not listening. And he then has another comparison. We have the comparison between the word spoken through who?
Angel.
Angels, and then the word spoken through
The Son.
the Son, the Lord, right? Verse 3, first spoken through the Lord, right? So we have this, again, we have these, not two words, but the word that was spoken by angels, which we were supposed to pay attention to, right? And so that now, how much more should we be paying attention to the word spoken through our Lord Jesus Christ? And so then we get into a little bit of the reason why we need to pay close attention, which is, why would we need to pay such close attention? Is it important, or is it just, you know, hey, it doesn't really matter?
It really matters.
It really, really matters. And why does it really, really matter?
For our salvation.
For our salvation, right? And so therefore we need to pay much closer attention. Now, what are verses 5 through 18 about?
Well, again, he's talking about Jesus.
Yes. And is he still comparing them to the angels? Beginning of verse 5?
But
He did not subject to angels the world to come.
But he subjected it to
Jesus.
To
says in
Jesus.
verse 8, it says he's put all things in subjection under his feet.
yes. And then it says in verse 9, we see him who was what?
made for a little while lower than the angels.
Right.
That's when he took on human flesh.
Right, and then he takes on human flesh so that he what, at the end of verse 9?
He can die
Right.
with glory and honor.
Yes,
And taste death for everyone.
Taste it.
yeah, taste death for everyone, and then in verse 10, it tells us that he is the author of our salvation, what, through what?
Suffering.
Through sufferings. And so then we see that he's doing something bigger than the angels, right? That's the comparison. He is doing something much bigger than the angels. But where was he when he did this much bigger than the angels thing? Beneath them, right? So he was made for a little while lower than the angels, but he did this thing that made him much greater than the angels. He took on the body so that he could taste death and be salvation, and by that he was given a name which was above every name, right? So he lowered himself, he emptied himself, and again, that's more of the theology of who he is. Now, what else does it say about him in the rest of the chapter?
It just kind of talks about his character and what he did
Right, and
as Son of God, or Son of Man.
and why was it necessary for him to take on flesh and blood?
So that through death he might render powerless the one who has the power of death, that is, Satan.
So he could be the perfect sacrifice.
Right, but also in verse 14, therefore, since the children, who are the children? Us, share in flesh and blood. So because we are human,
Right.
he had to be human,
That's what I
right?
mean, so he could be the perfect
Yes.
sacrifice. It's gonna take human blood.
Yes, it wasn't going to take the blood of
Yeah.
bulls and
No.
goats, but it was going to take the blood of a human. And so then it says in verse 16, what's his relationship to angels again? Again, we want to keep in mind where we see those angels.
He's not helping angels, he's helping us.
Right, he's giving help to the descendant of Abraham. Who are the descendants of Abraham?
Well, man.
Right, but spiritually, who
Oh,
are the
Jesus.
descendants of who?
All of
Spiritually,
us.
those who have faith,
Yeah,
right?
right.
So if we have faith, we are his descendants. Now, seed-wise and human, or physically, that's the word. Physically, it would be the Jewish people that are the descendants of Abraham, but it doesn't say that there. It doesn't say physical descendant, but it says, for he gives help to the descendant of Abraham. And then it says, therefore, verse 17, he had to be what?
Made like his brethren in all things,
Why?
so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest.
Right, and then what?
To make
Make
propitiation.
propitiation for the sins of the people.
Yeah, and then it gives another verse under it, verse 18. For since he himself was tempted in that which he has suffered, he is able to come to the aid of those who are tempted. So he overcame, right? Because he overcame, then he can help us. If he had failed, if he had sinned, if he had not been fully righteous, we would not have him as our helper. We would not have him as our high priest.
We wouldn't have Bible study.
We wouldn't have Bible study.
In
Or we-
more ways than one.
Or we would be studying the Old Testament still and looking for
Well,
that
that's true.
Messiah, right? I would hope we'd still be people of faith,
Raising
right?
goats and bulls.
Yeah, Karen.
Yeah. Okay, so now, if we were to just stop and look at chapters 1 and 2, could you see how they relate to one another? How what the subject matter is the same? What is the subject matter of chapters 1 and 2 that you could group together?
Jesus is higher than the angels.
Jesus is higher than the angels.
The reason why he's higher than angels,
Right.
his purpose for
Yeah.
coming, his role,
Yeah.
and what they do for us and what he does for us.
Right, and we can almost take it all the way back to verse 2. Let me make sure I'm saying the right verse. Verse 2 of chapter 1. In these last days, God has spoken to us in Him, in His Son. So again, and then it goes on to tell us, and again, like we've been noting, we have to pay close attention to what was spoken so that we do not drift away. So even chapter 2 is talking about paying really close attention to that which was spoken through Jesus. So it could be God spoke in His Son, and we have to pay attention so we don't drift away.
And it
Not-
ties it in with the salvation issue.
Yes, and we don't neglect our salvation, right? Okay, so what they tell us in how they divide this out basically is chapters 1 and 2 are together, and then the next division would be chapters 3 through 10. So, how does chapter 3 start? Chapter 3, verse 1.
Therefore.
Therefore, okay, so we're still building, right? We're still building on the thoughts that have been laid down before. But what does it tell us? What does it exhort us to do? What does he exhort us to do in verse 1?
Stay faithful.
Just in verse 1
Oh, I'm sorry.
of chapter 3.
Oh, to consider Jesus?
Consider Jesus. And then it goes on to tell us about him, right? So what would you say chapters, if we were to then kind of follow that flow of thought as you did, as you were supposed to in your homework, what would you say chapters 3 through 10 are about?
Christ is our eternal high priest, the fulfillment of the old covenant and mediator of the new.
Yes, so he is apostle and high priest, and the exhortation, according to our purpose, would be to consider him, right? And so it's going to tell us a lot about him and tell us what types of things we can consider while we are considering him, right? It's going to tell us more about Jesus, this high priest. And it's then it goes on to tell us about his faithfulness, right? Compared to who? In verses 2 through 6 of Hebrews 3.
Moses.
Yeah, so he's compared to Moses. So he'd already been compared to the prophets. He's already been compared to the angels. Now he's being compared to Moses. Then it says in verse 7, therefore, if you hear his voice, what?
Do not harden your hearts.
Right. And so we know that we need to do that anyway because chapter 2, verses 1 through 4 said the same thing, right? We already knew. So he's just saying it again. Make sure you're paying attention. Have your ears perked up because we need to know these things about him. If we hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. What did they do? Who does it compare believer? Well, okay. Let me back up. He's talking to the church at that time, right? Mm-hmm. So what does it say for us? Are we of this group that he's addressing? Therefore, if you hear his voice?
Yeah.
Are we those people that can hear his voice?
Mhm.
Now, he's comparing them to who in the Old Testament?
The Israelites.
Yeah,
Those who
right.
came out of Egypt.
Right, so he's saying,
Yes.
pay
Wandering in the
attention,
wilderness.
don't be
Yeah.
like these people. Why would we not want to be like them?
They didn't have faith.
They didn't have faith, but they also didn't obey, right?
They went
Because-
astray.
And they
They
didn't
went-
enter his rest.
They didn't
That's
enter
right.
his rest. And so then see how we're building? Okay, we're gonna just keep going, right? It's like a little snowball, right? So chapters 4 and 5, we see that rest, the discussion of that rest. And how does 4 start? Chapter 1, verse 1, chapter 4. Therefore,
Let us fear.
why?
So that you don't miss it, we don't miss the rest.
Right, so we don't miss getting in there, right?
Right.
And they missed it because they were disobedient and they didn't fear God, right? So he's saying, let us fear so that we can enter into the rest. And we have to, therefore, what's the next therefore in chapter 4? Where do you see that again?
Verse 11.
Verse 6.
Verse 6.
6, I missed it.
Uh-oh.
Oh, there it is.
Means for some to enter.
Okay.
They failed to get in because they were disobedient.
Right, and then it says at the end, and this is kind of not in verse 9, so, which is not a therefore, but it does help us to conclude the thought, so there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. And so we know we have a Sabbath rest, so therefore we need to, what does it say in verse 11? Since we know we have a Sabbath rest, therefore,
Let's be diligent.
To enter.
to enter that rest. And so we won't be disobedient, right?
Mhm.
And then there's another therefore in verse,
14.
11?
well, that was the 11th
Oh,
one. Yeah.
14.
What is that one?
Hold fast our confession.
But why? Why do we hold fast our confession?
Because we have a great high priest,
Right.
Jesus.
Right, and then it goes on to say, we don't have, and what kind of high priest is he?
One who was tempted but didn't fall. He knows our weaknesses, but he didn't do it.
Right, right. And then another, therefore, verse 16,
We can have confidence.
let us
near.
draw near
Yeah.
with confidence. So again, it's make sure you're paying attention. If you can hear his voice, keep your ears perked, be listening, be obedient to his voice so that you can enter this rest. And when you enter, you know that you have that rest because you know he did it, right? He accomplished it. He was our great high priest who passed through the heavens and entered that rest.
But
right?
we have to be diligent.
Mhm.
And I don't know if it was in this group or not, but someplace, I have a friend whose ex-husband, anyway, she's not affiliated with this group, but he claims he's her ex because of his choices in lifestyle, he's gonna slide into heaven.
Mm.
My mom always says she's gonna be on the mezzanine.
But see, this doesn't sound like there's any sliding.
No.
You know, we have to be diligent to obey. He wants to live his life the way he wants, and so, but, you know, he's accepted Jesus supposedly, and so therefore he's gonna slide in,
Right.
and this is making me think,
It's much more important than that.
And
it's
how
not
we
just some
live.
passive thing. It is active, like we talked about last
Yeah,
week. It's
yeah.
active Christianity.
Yeah,
He's not
yeah.
calling them to say a prayer
Make a
and
commitment,
walk an
yeah, yeah,
aisle
yeah.
and then move on.
You're right.
It is, since all of these things, this is how you live. And we're, you know, again, it's almost like a snowball. I mean, he is just rolling
Right.
this snowball from the beginning all the way, until we get to the end of chapter 12 where he starts with all the exhortations. So it's live like you know this truth. Because you know this truth, this is how you live. And he sprinkles in some this is how you lives along the way. But then the last couple of chapters is where he really gets into that word of exhortation that really tells you this is how you live in light of that. So it's that ball that's rolling. By the time it gets to the end of chapter 12, it's a pretty big ball, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, what I love is the exhortation, don't neglect so great a salvation.
Right.
We are
Yeah.
called to be lukewarm. I keep thinking about the churches in Revelation.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, and it's so important, right? And we have him as a great high priest. Why would, and that whole concept of why would we trample underfoot the Son of God? Remember that? I mean, that you stop and think about that, and you think about how horrible that would be, and yet there are those who would flippantly go, oh, you know, I'll just get in, right?
Yeah.
But this is not that kind of Christianity. Hebrews is not that kind of Christianity, right? They need to study the book of Hebrews.
I was just thinking, I don't like to read it too much.
Okay, so how does chapters, well, this is kind of a long question, but how do chapters, or what do chapters 5 through 10 contrast? We start to see him as a priest, right? And it's contrasting his high priesthood with what?
The former.
A human.
Right, yeah, the Levitical high priest. Good, so you saw that, and one of the ways that you could have seen that, just in case you didn't see that, when they asked us on day 3 to look, under question 2, to look for the various things or people the author compares to Jesus, and then list them, noting which chapters, as you looked at that, you marked what chapters, so you could start to see some of those segment divisions. You see, oh, he's talked about this over and over in this chapter, and this chapter, and this chapter, and hey, those chapters all go together. Imagine that. So it's a very fluid thought. So you would have started to see that was a segment division. So your segment division for chapters 5 through 10 is about the priesthood, right? He's being compared to the priesthood. Now, well, that's the same question. I don't know why I had that written down twice. Okay, sorry. What does he compare it to? The Levitical priesthood. We've got that. What does, let me make sure I'm in the wrong. I can't even count forward these days. 14, 15. Okay. Okay, the Old Testament tells about the Levitical priesthood and the sacrificial system of worship associated with the tabernacle. And then in these chapters, we see that Jesus is what compared to that old priesthood and the old tabernacle?
You mean-
He's much better, right?
Oh, yeah.
He's
He's
gone.
our eternal high priest.
They were shadows.
Right, I mean, it's just, it's little pictures almost. And this is the true tabernacle that he enters, right? And then what happens at the end of chapter, I know this is like, that's a big segment, but at the end of chapter 10, what does he tell them to do?
You know, when it talks about the shadow,
Uh-huh.
I remember in school, a teacher, we were reading Plato, and Plato also talked about the shadow, the life here was, I mean, it makes me think of it anyway, when we're talking about when I was in high school, that was a long time ago. But the picture has stayed in my mind, that the teacher expressed it to us that it, and I guess Plato wrote it this way, that it's like you're in a cave, and somebody around the curve of the cave has a fire going, and and they're moving around this fire. You are seeing their shadow on the wall. So you know they're there, but it's not the actual person. And somehow that resonated with me, and it just stayed in my head.
Right.
So that now in reading this, I grab what he's talking about, that the temple here is just a shadow,
Right.
you know, of the real one in heaven. It's a picture I hang on to that really, you know, me have to do good pictures. And
No,
that just
that's
really
right.
speaks it to me that we're just seeing the shadow on the wall.
Just the very little bit of it, right?
And it's proof to us that it exists
That there is a real,
because we're seeing the
Yeah.
shadow of it moving.
I like that.
I do
like
too,
that.
I
That's
like
good. That's good. Okay, right there at the end of, or middle, let's say middle of chapter 10, verse 19, we have another therefore. So chapters 5 through 10, 18 have been talking about this comparison between the old priesthood, the new priesthood. We talk about Melchizedek, we talk about all that stuff, right? What does it say in verse 19?
That we have that confidence.
Therefore, brethren, since we have what?
Confidence
To
enter the holy place by the blood of Jesus.
And we know we have that confidence because he's gone through
Yeah,
all of
right.
that, right, in
Right.
these previous statements. What are we to do in verse 22, 23, 24? There's some let us's.
Yeah.
Fast, stimulate,
Consider how to
Don't
stimulate.
forsake someone. Yeah.
Right, so do you see how that snowball has finally rolled to
Yeah.
where now that we know all of these things and we know we can have confidence, now let's do it, right? Let's draw near with a sincere heart in full assurance of faith. Let's hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, and let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds, and not forsake our own assembling together. So we see that we have this really important task ahead of us. It's not just, I have this head knowledge, it's now I need to do this, I'm going to walk this out. And then there's a warning, right? Because exhortation usually comes with a warning, doesn't it?
Yes.
If you don't do this,
Right.
this is going to happen. What's the warning there?
Yeah.
Do not throw away your confidence.
Right, do not throw away your confidence. And what does it say in verse 29?
More severe punishment.
Yeah, for those
If we
who
go on sinning willfully.
Yeah, so if we keep on doing the things that we think we're allowed to do, even, and all I had to do was raise my hand and walk an aisle, and now I can live how I want to. If I go on sinning willfully, that's verse 26, after receiving the knowledge of the truth, then I wipe out that sacrifice for sins, right? And then it also says in verse 29 that tramples underfoot the Son of God. Oh my goodness. And then it gets worse. Regarded as unclean the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified and has insulted the Spirit of grace. I mean, we talked about this last week. Do we
pretty
really
radical.
think about our sin, our willful sin, this way on a daily basis? No. We don't. But if we did, it would make us stop and consider, right?
Well, it's terrifying. It is.
Right. Yes. And then it says it's terrifying to fall into the hands of the living God. And then someone mentioned already, verse 35, therefore what?
Do not throw away your confidence.
It has a great reward. And then it says, for we have need of something.
Endurance.
Yeah, we've got to push through because it's going to be hard, right? We've seen some of the things that have been hard. He's just talked about those in those verses before, the public spectacle, the reproaches, the tribulations, being put in prison. Those kinds of things are going to happen. We have to endure through it, right? Okay, and then it says, verse 39, it's so nice, we have that confidence again that we are not what?
Those who shrink back to destruction.
But of those
Who
who...
have faith, the preserving of the soul.
Okay, so what does chapter 11 talk about?
Everybody.
Faith.
Faith, yeah. So we see what a faith can do, right? And we see each of these men and women who lived by faith being preserved, right? That though they didn't see the promise, yet we have the testimony from God that they have gone to the heavenly city, right? That they've gotten there. Even though they didn't get there on earth, they got there. What about chapter 12, verse 1? What's our therefore there?
Well, he's just talking about all these witnesses and their endurance and their perseverance and the race they ran. Now, you got a race, you run it.
Right, so we have this great cloud of witnesses that stands behind us and above us and be around us and all of that, right? And so therefore let us. So again, we're getting into more of the exhortation of the book. We're getting into the how do we live. And it is that lay aside every encumbrance, run with endurance, fixing our eyes on Jesus. And then verse 3, we come all the way back to where we were at the beginning of the book. We are to consider him. That's chapter 3, verse 1. Let us consider Jesus, who has endured such hostility. And why are we to do that? Verse 3 of chapter 12.
So you'll
So
not grow
we'll not
weary.
grow weary.
Yeah, so it's keep our eyes on Jesus, right? If we keep our eyes on him, knowing what he went through, knowing what he endured, knowing his sacrifice, then we cannot grow weary too, right? We just put all of our trust and hope in him. And that's the faith, right? Eyes on him, but it's eyes of faith, right? And we have the great cloud of witnesses before us that tell us that that's how that works. And then as we get into the rest of the chapter, we see that rest of the book, we see those exhortations. So what would you call that last Hebrews 11 through 13 chapters? 11 through 13. What would you call that segment?
I said practical implications and applications.
Okay, I like that.
Well, I had P's,
Oh, okay.
because I had priesthoods compared.
Oh, okay. Oh, I like that.
And then
So you were,
presenting Jesus was the first one.
look at you. See, she's the one to go to if you need to know how to do all of these. Anybody else have something that they would kind of summarize chapters 11 through 13?
It just shows what faith should look like.
Yes. And the faith should look like, who is the author and perfecter of our faith? Jesus. It should look like Jesus, right? That's pretty easy to remember, right? Our faith should look like Jesus. Okay, so next week we are going to dig in to our chapter 1 even more. We're going to get into some of those really intense details.